Hi, everybody. It says you are live. So we're live. So um, we do this where we allow pretty much anyone to join. Software allows up to 10 people. We like having people. But this also streams in real time to YouTube. And we have a bunch of people who, just ask questions in the back channel. And I see there are 12, 14 people now watching in YouTube. And for anyone who doesn't know, I know I've mentioned it before, but when we started MacAdmin Monthly, one of the first places I announced it was at the MaxSysAdmin conference in Sweden. So we still get a ton of people who stream sort of like late at night for them. So we do get people watching and rewatching the YouTube stream, which is a lot of fun. And speaking of starting Admin Monthly, this month, this iteration, this 10th anniversary. How nice is that? And it started out as an in-person meetup, mostly that we would record and let people watch later. And it's really kind of, you know, not necessarily because of the pandemic, but it slowly turned into this like, hey, we should just stream this and make life easy for a lot of people. So yeah, that's a lot of fun. And really excited this month to welcome Zach Wasserman. And I'm so excited to hear more about all the stuff you're doing, Fleet DM and OS Query. And it's such an interesting space. And it's interesting that it isn't Mac or MacAdmin specific, but so many people in the Mac community use it. And if I remember in the way back time, OS Query was a project that came out of Facebook, and it was Mac first, right? Like that's
That's
something that
right.
helped. Yeah, that's something that helped it sort of like take hold in the Mac community. Um, so yeah, don't let me hold us up and talk more about nonsense. Why don't you tell us who you are, what you do, how you got to where you are, and all the good things.
Totally. Just course correct me if I start rambling, please. But yeah, Ed, you're right. OS Query it was Mac first, and so I mean, again, I'm Zach Wasserman. I'm currently on the OS Query Technical Steering Committee. I helped create OS Query back in 2014 at Facebook, and I'm the co-founder and CTO of Fleet DM, which is an open core OS Query Fleet Manager. So yeah, back in 2014, we were at Facebook. We had everyone, pretty much all of the engineers and certainly a substantial amount of the company working on Macs, super underserved. We were the security team. We were super underserved by the existing vendors, and we believed in open source software. So we built OS Query as a way to start getting visibility into the state of Macs and Linux as well. Windows came later, so these days OS Query is a solution that works across the three major platforms. No mobile or anything like that yet, although certainly curious if Apple ever exposed some useful APIs in iOS or something like that to get there. But yeah, in 2014 we created OS Query. The idea was we want to improve the visibility of configurations on Mac for the IT folks, for the security folks that are responsible for securing and making these machines work. And we want it to be performant so that folks could actually run it without their users complaining too much. And what we came up with became OS Query. So I think the cool central insight to OS Query is let's take all these disparate data sources that an admin might be interested in across the operating system, say user accounts on the system, processes that are running, information about files on the file system, the software that's installed, and let's abstract all of that into a SQL dialect, which in fact is just SQLite, which is something that a lot of admins and folks have seen before, and if haven't seen before, at least can learn relatively easily. and give access to all of the different pieces of data using that same uniform interface. And so like these days, there's I think over 100 different tables that you can use on Mac OS for different data sources. And like the massive advantage of this with OS Query over doing this kind of thing by hand is like we don't have to write a Python script or whatever to parse the data. Like it's just there when we start working with OS Query. And then at Fleet, we're working on helping to capture that value by delivering more of the insights that admins are trying to get to, understanding how your compliance is with organizational policies, keeping track of the software that's installed, um, and supporting our users.
Yeah, like that's a really critical component to OS Query that people may or may not realize. Like you can go have the client and report all this data, but you need some place to report it to, right? Like you need some place to kind of collect all this data.
Yeah, for sure. So in the beginning, it was really like OS Query just logged the data right to the file system, and you could ship it off to your Splunk or your Elasticsearch cluster. And essentially, that's still what folks are doing. But these days, a lot of people choose to use Fleet as a place to manage the configurations, get some of the higher level use cases kind of built in out of the box, and help to get the logs to the destination that you want.
Yeah, I think the growth of OS Query has been really interesting because there are definitely a number of vendors that like sort of like ship their own OS Query as part of their tool, which really speaks volumes to the power of OS Query. Probably everyone on this call is an OS Query user or has it deployed to their fleet. I mean, I know I do. And speaking of the expansion of the platforms, um, I had, there's this very small growing need where I am for Windows. They need some Windows things. So it's like, yeah, we're going to set this up in Amazon Workspaces and you're just going to get to use it from there. But you have to make sure OS Query goes on this, right? Like I was like, number one request, like immediately, like, yes, we still need our endpoint agents on these Windows machines. So, and OS Query is a big part of that.
And Ed, what are the kind of use cases that you're using OS Query for in your org?
Right now we're, that's actually funny. That's a big like Q1 project for me because OS Query was around before me at my current gig. And I did start looking at it recently. Like I'm sort of like the recipient of a lot of OS Query information. We do use Fleet, and then that sends it through to Splunk. I was going through a lot of these queries. I'm like, okay, do we need these? Like, is this information serving us the way we think it's serving us? Like, um, so I definitely have a Q1 project of like, okay, I need to go through these, all the queries that it's running and see like, yes, we need this. Good, keep it. No, or this is running too frequently. Like you said, one of the main tenets of OS Query was to be performant, and it definitely is. But you can definitely go astray by like, hey, schedule this query every 60 seconds. No. That's don't need to do that. So yeah, I need to kind of go through some of those. But I think it's giving us a lot of the basics. And as someone who's gone through a transition from, I guess you'd call traditional networking to Beyond Corp or Zero Trust networking, and then being at a company that was really helping define some of that. Where I'm at now, like I'm helping to try to define what posture looks like, and OS Query is a fantastic way of figuring out like, okay, what do we actually call a machine, right? Like what is a machine? It's an interesting exercise, but OS Query definitely plays into a lot of that.
Yeah, that Beyond Corp Zero Trust movement is something that we see a lot of folks wanting to use OS Query and Fleet for. And it these things can become the source of so much of this information that you'd like to use to define the posture and to manage access based on that device posture. So that's cool to hear that you're pursuing that as well. And I heard you talking about it can be kind of difficult to figure out, what to do with those query, and are we collecting the data at the right intervals and that sort of thing. How manageable is the performance? And for sure, these are real challenges and things that the I think that we have a set of folks who've been working with OS Query for many years who have kind of an intuitive sense for this. And at Fleet, we're trying to build some of that kind of knowledge and understanding into the product. And I actually have a demo that I'll show some of these sort of things as we, whenever we feel like getting to that.
Yeah, please.
Awesome. So pardon me for a moment while I try to get my screen shared.
Screen share roulette is a real thing in 2021. It's like, does it work today? Or have I, or did I install something new that doesn't have privacy preferences yet?
We did a brief test before we went live, so we will hope to see that work again.
For sure. And it's also like, who's going to send me an embarrassing text message?
Okay, I think I need to do this. Add to stream. Magic.
All right.
Hey.
Awesome. So here we are in the Fleet dashboard. I'm essentially just running a local test instance with a handful of simulated Linux devices, and I've got my actual Mac OS host enrolled here. So probably the thing that folks are most familiar with in OS Query is like this query idea. You get OS Query I, you can run queries and get the results of them from your system. So here's doing that on, again, my local machine. This is the same as what I could be doing in OS Query I. Of course, from a basic perspective, we can just start looking at some of the common tables to look at, like processes, and this is going to list all of the processes running on my machine. Oh, and this something has a really wide command line, so we could improve the rendering here. Live demos. We can we again with these questions of what are the things that I should be looking for when I come in with OS Query. This is something that we're kind of trying to do with Fleet as providing conventions, allowing everything to be configurable, but providing some conventions of things to look for. So, for example, I can find information about whether gatekeeper is turned on my machine, and like we were talking about before, so this query would return only if gatekeeper was turned off. So I know my machine's good there, and we don't actually have one that would return. But like we were talking about before, there's also this idea of device posture. Like, let's make sure that gatekeeper is enabled, and I want to see like an inventory of devices that have it enabled and devices that have it disabled. So this is something that we get right through Fleet, and again, it's just built on the OS Query query, but we can see here, my device does have gatekeeper enabled. There's no devices right now that don't have gatekeeper enabled. And you can create these queries based on OS Query queries. So any of these data sources that are available from OS Query can be used to specify these, what we call policies. And then, for example, Ed, when you're thinking about the kind of use cases you're talking about with device posture, you could query the Fleet API to get some of this information directly and not have to worry as much about going to something like Splunk to do these kinds of lookups, or making a live query at the time that you're interested in it.
Yeah, I think that's the trick for me. It's like so we use FleetDM, and it's great for those live queries, but I still want to dump out to Splunk because I want time series information. I don't like, it's useful to know like, oh, right now, what's the status of something across my fleet, but it's also very useful to know like, hey, how has this thing changed over time? Or did this machine ever, like, not only is Gatekeeper enabled now, like, was it ever disabled? Like, that's what I want to know.
Yeah, for sure. And that's where, the OS query schedule comes in. And that's, I imagine, what you're using to get this data into Splunk. So you can come over here and say, give me the information about Gatekeeper, and I want to run this query every 15 minutes. And now Fleet will start running this. One more thing about performance is this hasn't run yet, so we don't have any information here, but we're working on kind of giving the intuitive sense of performance over here. We've come up with like minimal, moderate, and can't remember the term that we've used for something that's basically high performance impact. And we really, this is really a lot of what you're seeing here, or essentially all of what you're seeing here. It's really just built up right on OS query using the pure open source stuff that's available in the agent, but we're just trying to render it in ways that are a bit more intuitive and more useful. So another thing that we're doing is pulling like the software inventory off of a device, for example. And this again is like, this is pretty easily available off of OS query to query this information, and you can get it into your Splunk. But there's also more that you might like to do, like, for example, detecting vulnerabilities in the software that you have installed. And so we've recently kind of embarked on that, and we can come down here and look at like, oh, well, here's a vulnerable version of a spell that I have installed, and link to that CVE, for example. So like a topical one this week is like everyone's thinking about log4j, and so there's some resources out there online about queries that you can run on OS query to detect exploit attempts from that log4j stuff. And also we are, I think, about to publish a blog post, if we haven't already, with some queries that we that work on Mac and Linux to detect running Java processes that have log4j loaded. So this is like really cool kind of thing where you're, something big happens, and maybe I don't manage just these 8 hosts like I have in my demo environment, but I'm wondering across my thousands, which of them are potentially running these vulnerable versions. And you can just come over here and run your live query to detect those kind of things. And again, it's all just OS query. Like, this is essentially the same as what you get by going to, running your OS query I on after you'd SSH into the system or something like that, but it aggregates across all of those different hosts that are running. And I'll note, by the way, everything that we're looking at here is free and open source on Fleet. So when I said earlier that Fleet's open core, basically we've got like some premium features that are still source available that we put on top, but everything that I'm showing here is like, please come use it for free, do whatever you want with it, and we hope that it's useful.
Yeah, you mentioned the log4j stuff. I meant to mention sort of up top, like, man, what timing, right? We definitely started talking about you joining us certainly prior to the log4shell madness breaking out. And it is funny, like, being on the security side now. That's a constant quest or question for your user base, particularly the more technical people who are just sort of like always studying their machine, and they're like, do you need all of these endpoint agents? And they're just different tools in your tool belt, right? They each have their pros and cons and tell you like these slightly different things sometimes. So yeah, they're useful. They all kind of give you this different signal and different level of information. And certainly, I think everyone over the last few days has really been appreciative of whatever resources they have that can let them sort of dig into the whole log4j thing, like where their queries run, what jar files do I have across my fleet, particularly servers. I think those of us purely managing endpoints, like, we've been pretty lucky in terms of, like, well, they're probably not affected, right? Like, that's good news. You might have some services that your endpoints rely on that you want to go check and dig into, and again, being on the security side and having access to a lot of infrastructure, like, it was no joke, man. Within an hour of that announcement, you looked at your logs and you just started seeing the scans of from everywhere. Like, some of them are interesting because it's probably not malicious, but it's something like gray noise or one of these other security scanners that are just trying to find out what's out there. Like, okay, but then there's the clearly malicious stuff, and it's just, this one's particularly bad because there have been bad exploits before, but this one's so easy. You just type a string into a text box.
Which one, Ed? The first one or the second one?
The whole thing, the whole log4j thing is just so easy. When you say the first one or the second one, you mean the first version of it, the second version of it, or log4j version 2 versus log4j version 1? Like, we're going to be finding the impacts of this for months, if not years. I mean,
I'm just being silly.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, and I mean, I think all of this is just more evidence that, like, computers are hard. Security is difficult. Like, really doing anything with computers is difficult, and especially as our organizations grow more complex, like the software we're growing is more complex. Like, who would have thought it's the logging library that becomes the vector for remote code execution? I probably, if I'm a security person at some company, I probably wasn't logging the logging before. The logging was supposed to help me find the bad stuff. So, we have to be able to pivot quickly. And I think that having tools like OS Query out on our systems, like, it's free. It can be who logs the loggers. Yeah, saw someone posted that in the chat. But having these tools, even if it's just sitting there ready to go so that you can SSH out onto your machines and start to run these things to detect, where that log4j is and which version it is that's running, or who knows what the new, the newest vulnerability is going to be on Mac OS or on any of our devices. And I think that having the visibility is important. And also, to what you were saying, Ed, like, there's a very real cost to collecting a lot of this stuff. Like, you pay for those bytes that sit in Splunk, and you pay for the cycles that it uses, burning up someone's lap on their laptop and preventing them from getting their work done. And so I think being able to kind of be dynamic and respond to the changing conditions of this complex world is like an exciting thing to be able to do.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can still remain somewhat sane about the whole thing because, as far as I can tell, my infrastructure is not affected, so it's still like a fun exercise. I am glad I'm not at some place that's like, oh man, we're owned. Before we continue on too much, we do have a Slack channel where people who are maybe watching by a stream or want to ask a question, ask it there. So before this scrolls, I think you kind of touched on this, but someone posted in the channel, customers often ask for ways to scan for specific CVEs. Is that a thing you can do these days?
Yeah, totally. So there's a few different ways that you can do this kind of thing with OS Query. and Fleet. So I think it looks like the question is maybe asking about what I showed in the demo. So I'll just pull that back up and try to give you a sense for what was going on there. So what we're doing in Fleet right now is essentially just pulling the information about the software inventory, which software is installed on all the devices, which is relatively easily retrievable via a query in OS Query. If you go to, I think, fleetdm.com/queries, for example, we have our software inventory query should be on there. So like here's a query, little verbose, but here's a query that pulls all of the software installed on a Mac OS system. So what we're doing in Fleet now is we're pulling this information into the kind of host model that we maintain. So here's the 575 different installed pieces of software that were detected on my machine. And then we are mapping those to vulnerabilities. So for example, here again is that A-spell vulnerability. And if we come here, we can see the information about the vulnerability from NIST. And what we're doing is essentially NIST with the NVD, National Vulnerability Database, just publishes the information about which software is vulnerable. And so we kind of map the software inventory to these CPEs, and then we map the relevant CVEs for the CPEs, and then we can tell you, you have this piece of vulnerable software installed on these devices. So that's kind of one way you can do, you can deal with CVEs. The other would be, and what we're, I think, about to publish again on our blog, and there's some other resources out there for doing this with OS Query. The other thing is, maybe there's some behavior that you would want to detect to look for that CVE, or maybe you want to look for, in the case of today with log4j, I want to look for running Java processes that actually have the log4j classes loaded. And you'll see that we put together a query that can do that and help you kind of pick up the vulnerability of today. The reason we can't pick up log4j through this mechanism is because we don't really detect the libraries that are built into each of these pieces of software. So we're looking at the CVEs that are published for the software itself. So wow, curl 7.19. Oh yeah, so this is back on CentOS 6. Curl.7.19 is looking pretty bad. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, I think it does. Thank you. Yeah, going through your list there, you don't have Xcode installed on that machine, I guess, huh?
Definitely at least the command line tools, but I try to I try to avoid Xcode where I can.
So funny enough, it has been mentioned that Xcode ships with a vulnerable log4j. I think version 2.11.
Oh, really?
But unlike so much of Xcode that requires, a full Xcode download, there is a background process that updates certain components, and this is one that the first time that runs, it will replace log4j with a non-vulnerable version. But there is this very short window of time where that might be detected on a machine.
Oh wow, that's news to me. That is very interesting. So I just checked, and the software inventory says that my machine's got Xcode 13.2.
Yeah, going down the Xcode path, I know I've seen developers also mention a bunch of other things. I think there's a new version dropping very shortly because Xcode 13 was not a great initial release.
Lucky number 13.
Another question in the channel from someone who's on the stream. Just ask it. It's fine.
So you said you pay for the bytes that that are stored in Splunk. At what point in scale does it make sense to, rather than ship and store all those device details, to just do the deltas?
Yeah, totally. At what point? I think it depends on the organization and your budget and your appetite for these things. But I would say, I'm not sure if you're aware, and this is why you're asking, but OS Query does ship the deltas. You can configure it to ship only the deltas of what's changing between the runs of the queries, and that is a very common way for folks to kind of reduce the total number of bytes stored.
Yeah, that's a good question, though.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of guidelines around that, like in my experience, it's certainly easier to deal with full logs than differential logs. But depending on the frequency of your query and the kind of data that you're working with, you could be easily generating orders of magnitude more logs. So it's a question of, do I have the budget to pay for Splunk like this, and is it worth having is it worth putting in a little bit of extra effort to reconstruct the state based on those diffs versus kind of manually when doing some sort of response investigation versus looking at the full state each time it was logged. But of course, if you've got a fleet manager like Fleet, you can run a live query to see what's the state now, and you can look at your recent diffs and kind of walk backwards from there, for example. So there's a lot of ways to do it, and I'd say it's like more art than science in terms of thinking of what do I need to achieve my goals, and are the goals around compliance, are they around security, and so very situation specific.
Right. Yeah. It's funny, shipping and storing a bunch of stuff, and mentioning multiple endpoint agents. Like, that's one of the greatest tricks to me. Like, do they all agree? If I'm getting data from OS Query and Monkey and, CrowdStrike or whatever, like, can I match that all up? And are they all saying the same thing where those points can align? Like, something as basic as, like, what version of the OS are you running on? And, you know, you definitely want to be able to sort of like triangulate those points and make sure that this is giving me the correct picture.
Yeah, for sure.
Have you implemented a way to do that programmatically, or is it just kind of a spot check, Ed?
You can link them up in Splunk, which is, one way, to sort of like these novel length queries that sort of like can hit a bunch of different indexes. That's one way to do it. That's something I've been looking at a little bit more lately, sort of like digging into that. And, if you have multiple points, you get that one outlier and it's like, okay, why are you wrong? Or like, why are you saying something different?
Yeah, and often folks are making important decisions based on this data, so the accuracy and quality of it is super important. And I think it's really common for folks to have multiple agents and do this kind of correlation. And again, I think it's a matter of prioritization. How accurate do I need this information? How high is the risk associated with this? Or how much will my users be impacted if I have a misunderstanding of this piece of information?
So what can you share with us, if anything, about the future of Fleet DM, right? Like, where's this going, or what's next? What's on the roadmap? What's the next big thing?
Yeah, totally. I think the big things coming up are we're really going to invest more in this idea of policies and helping to understand device posture, both for folks who want to use it from that like zero trust kind of perspective, or to achieve compliance goals and that kind of thing. We also want to work on creating a good venue for admins to communicate with the users. And we've got some plans for something called Fleet Desktop coming up, which would be essentially a menu bar icon that tries to, find some balance between super annoying and completely invisible, a la Nudge, perhaps, which I'm sure folks are familiar with. Different escalating levels of ways to get the user's attention to remediate issues like, like gatekeeper's been turned off, or whatever it is that you need done. Maybe someone's using an application that's not allowed by your local IT policies and that kind of thing. So that's a big thing on the Fleet product front. We're going to be, again, you talked about accuracy. We're going to be really focusing on the accuracy of the data coming out of OS Query and what Fleet's rendering. So we've just hired our first full-time OS Query engineer at Fleet, Charvel Shah, who's been doing a lot of Mac OS stuff in OS Query going back to, I think, like 2015 or so. So he's going to be focused on kind of like core OS Query stability, and also helping us improve the ways that OS Query reports information about like the performance metrics, the reliability of all of, both the operational and the sort of primary logging information that OS Query produces, and then making sure that what you're seeing in the Fleet UI is accurate and believable. And it's certainly my hope that Fleet will become a place where you can go like, oh, it says this software version's there, like that's right. I don't have to second guess that. So lots of investment in those things. And I think another big one is making it easier to install OS Query, manage it over time, manage the performance impacts. OS Query does have quite a bit of tooling for helping to manage those impacts, but we can always do a better job of treating our users better in terms of never preventing them from getting their work done, and making sure that our production workloads and our servers are always helping the business earn money, or keeping folks safe, or whatever it is that those need to do. So that's some things that come to mind.
That's awesome. Well, I will definitely say, like, I'm glad to hear all of those things, and performance is always a consideration. But I will have to definitely say, dealing with a technical base, developers and whatnot, I don't think I've ever heard anyone call out OS Query. I've heard them call out every other endpoint agent, but I don't think I've ever heard anyone complain about OS Queries using all my CPU or something like that. So, maybe I have it tuned just right. I know that's not true, but it's definitely not the thing that people complain about.
I can share some queries with you if you want them to complain.
It has its warts for sure, and I think ultimately there's definitely ways to be bit, and you probably will over time. But I think that it's been, this consideration about performance has been baked into OS Query from the very beginning. It was kind of like the tenets of OS Query when we created it were like basically threefold. One, focus on Mac OS and Linux, because they were totally underserved at that time. Two, have performance that means this thing can actually be deployed everywhere. And three, provide an interface that's usable to a person who's not a software engineer. You don't have to write Python, you just write SQL and you can learn that. So Victor's seen it. Folks who've managed large OS Query deployments have definitely seen performance issues, but we're always eager to improve that and make sure that OS Query is something that you can feel good about having out there.
Yeah, I was definitely excited to see that in the release notes. I haven't upgraded to the latest version yet, where you do have that indication of the impact of a query. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, awesome.
I'll ask another question from the channel, and I think we touched on this already, but how do the future plans include having the fleet interface work with time series data, often shipped externally for compliance reporting? So maybe that will continue to be a third-party opportunity, or maybe you're going to take some of that on. So I think that's the question.
Yeah, I think I see compliance reporting in there, and so that makes me think of policies. And again, when I talk about we want to invest in the policies concept that I showed there, I think one thing is definitely going to be over time. How is the compliance of policies going? You know, are we trending up, down? When we have an audit, can we say at this point in time, this is where everything was, or let me look at a particular system. Did it change over time? And then also to be able to segment those kind of things across, you know, business units in the organization, or what we call teams in the fleet product. So we're definitely going to look into doing that. I think there's a reality that, you know, we're like a 15-person startup, and we're not going to compete with Splunk or Elastic in terms of storing arbitrary unstructured data. Like we just couldn't hope to compete in that space as of now. So if it's arbitrary unstructured data, like there will always be a great place to, you know, ship it to Snowflake, use Panther for your CM detections, you know, ship it to Splunk, ship it to Elastic, Graylog, like so many great options out there. But more and more when it comes to like questions about the individual device that OS Query has really good answers to, like we're definitely hoping to unify all of that into the interface that you have in Fleet. And then I'd say as well, try to integrate better with these other systems. You know, like Ed, you're talking about deploying, shipping the logs to Splunk. Like I'd love it if you can get from the device details page in Fleet into Splunk, see all the logs from that device, and from Splunk, get back into that device details page in Fleet. So these things are on our mind for sure.
Yeah,
Great question. Thanks.
Very cool. That'd be very cool. Something that you touched on earlier when you were sharing your screen and giving the demo that I wanted to call out that I think is really important is you talked about, you know, sort of making that interface easier for admins and, you know, sort of a little friendlier. And like that's been a nice trend, I think, in admin tools in general. But, you know, we definitely see more and more people coming on to Mac administration who are just either newer to it or, you know, so anything that makes that easier is just always a huge win, always a huge win. Like I think I understand this correctly, that was really like when Jamf acquired or acqui-hired Duncan's company, Mondada. The name escaped me there for a minute. Mondada, and like that was his whole premise of like, how do we make user interfaces better and more consistent and easier? And you know, and their patching product obviously played into that. But I know just before they got acquired, he gave a number of talks at different conferences about like how important that user interface, you know, is and consistency. So you know, and I know we have some other people on the call who might deal with products of that nature and, you know, how important the friendliness and ease of use is to people. So definitely that's a big win.
Yeah, that really resonates with me as well, Ed, and something that we've added recently to Fleet is some role-based access control, where there's now like an observer role that you can predefine the queries that the observer gets access to, and they can still see that device details page in the software inventory, but they don't have the complete unfettered access to every device on the system or to run any arbitrary query they want. So I'm a big believer in like the more people within the organization we can get access to OS Query in a limited way, in a way that makes, you know, the kind of blast radius limited, so we don't have to worry too much about that, the more that folks will be able to self-serve, and we'll all see more use out of these tools. So I think that having those interfaces is super important.
Yeah, that's great. And that's exciting news. I'll be right back. I'm going to go upgrade right now. Now, role-based access control is fantastic to hear, because that's been a sticking point for me. You know, like, we want to reduce who has unfettered admin across everything. And yeah, up till now, Fleet was sort of like admin or nothing. Like, everybody's an admin. So
there's good news and bad news for you, Ed. The good news is there's now sort of 3 levels of access that are fairly distinct and useful. And then if you want to be able to segment that kind of thing across like organizational units in your organization, that's where like the premium features within Fleet come in. So we've been focusing on kind of all the open source stuff up till now, but we'll be looking to talk to the purchasing department if you want to get to that.
Okay. I think we are paying customers. I'll have to check. Very cool. Very cool. Anyone else have any questions? All right. Silence means I have an actual segue here, in that is a question and sort of an outro. On the way out, we usually talk about conferences, events, things happening that people should be aware of and go do. I remember a few years ago, and you may or may not know about this, but I know Victor has some knowledge about QueryCon. I don't remember exactly who ran that or how that was put on, but I do remember hearing about it, thinking, man, this sounds really cool. I can't make it this year. I'm going to go next year. And then there was just never a next year. But I think that's so important, because, again, OS Query is such an important piece of so many people's management and security, postures. I'm curious if we're ever going to see the return of QueryCon.
Yeah, I mean, Victor and I were both at Collide when we threw the first QueryCon, which was awesome. There was a second QueryCon, which took place in New York, actually, hosted by Trail of Bits, who's been their consulting shop, who've been big supporters of OS Query over the years. And yeah, Sam, I saw you said there's a similar conference that Upticks has been throwing a couple of times that they call OS Query at Scale. And I've been telling the Trail of Bits folks that we got to get QueryCon back on, and we'll see if we kick it off or if Fleet has to try to throw our own conference. But personally, I love talking about these things, meeting the community, and with this all built on the open source and the community that we built up around it, and the fact that there are folks at Apple and the largest organizations using things like OS Query, and we can get to these conferences and talk to them and share stories and all of that. I mean, I can't wait to get back in the room with all y'all.
Yeah, I still have the banners from the original QueryCon. I'm redoing my office, so I'm going to hang them when my office is done.
That's awesome.
Nice. Yeah, and I guess that would bring us to that segment of like conferences. It's such a difficult thing to figure out now, and who's doing what. I think virtual conferences have worked out fairly well, but the frustrating part for me is, now I've met so many more people, and one of the functions of conferences was really to make these connections and introduce people, and particularly introduce the new people to this in the space to the old guard, and make those connections. So when people had questions after the conference was over, they might not feel so awkward of like emailing someone or getting them on Slack or something like that. And that's something that we're really missing out on. So same thing. Like, I can't wait to get back in person. I have really high hopes for 2022. I don't know. I've lost track now if anyone's planning anything. I think
supposedly
traditionally one of the.
MacAduck is happening at the end of March
I
in
was just
Brighton.
gonna say, traditionally MacAduck would be sort of the first one that would hit, and MacAduck was one of those that the pandemic impacted right away, and they moved it to the end of the year. Like, most people thought, like, oh, we're going to be over this in a few weeks, no big deal, and had to cancel again and rescheduled and canceled. And I think, I don't know, March is tough, particularly given, like, maybe they get a local crowd, but being in England, crossing international borders in March might be a bit early for me personally. I think, good luck to them. I hope they pull that off, and I think then we'd have either Mac DevOps or Penn State. They're both right around the same time.
June, July.
But in a more sensible sort of like June, July. It's warmer. More outdoor activities, perhaps.
I'm beginning to think that, much like the computer you always want is about $5,000, the conference you always want to go to is about 3 months away from now.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling it's going to sit in that perpetual delayed state, and we will get excited and disappointed and excited and disappointed and excited and disappointed multiple times between now and the time we actually get to all see each other and buy a round at the pub.
Yeah. So, I don't know. It's so frustrating because, like, there's still a pandemic going on, and it's really serious, and numbers are going up, but no one's actually using data to make decisions, right? Like, like in New York, like we always say, like, there are these thresholds, and if we cross these thresholds, these things happen. And I don't think we're ever going back to a shutdown the way that first shutdown happened, just because people are over it, right? People are done, which is
that's been the really infuriating thing about DC's metrics and their dashboard, was that they had color-coded dashboards, red, yellow, green.
Yep.
And then someone asked the mayor, why are you going by your own color codes? And she was like, oh, those color codes were accidental.
Oh.
And, like, I am certain that the user experience designer for that has other opinions on the subject, who has been told not to say anything. And of course, now the color scheme has changed, and it's all like neutral colors, and nothing means anything. And, like,
yeah. But I think, a piece of it is just like people are done. Like, I think, New York has instituted some more vaccine rules and mask mandates, and, like, that's great. But I don't think we're ever going back to, like, no indoor dining. Like, that, just no one's going to put up with it. So, like, what does that mean for conferences and actual get-togethers? Like, I think they're just going to start to happen because people are fed up with it, and you'll have to sort of just, like, determine your own risk level and risk averseness. And while I think, like, personally, I'm generally sort of, like, very risk tolerant, this is one of those cases where I've just been, like, towing the line on everything. Like, I do not want to, I'm vaxxed and everything, but, like, I'm very conscious of, like, I do not want to spread this. I do not want to give this to anyone else, blah, blah, blah. So, like I said, like, crossing international borders might be too soon for me, but it might not be too soon for other people. So who knows? But you should have a good beat on this, Tom Bridge, because of MacAdmin's podcast. You're always announcing things like this. What else do we have coming up that we have to look forward to?
Well, I was going to say, I think that's the only one that I know of that's actually meant for in person right now. I don't think any of the other conferences have committed one way or the other. I think that, it's very interesting. My wife is a product manager for a company that does a lot of WordPress, and they are starting to have their in-person WordCamps again after I think by the time it'll have been done, it'll be a 23-month hiatus. And of course, the first one's in lovely Birmingham, Alabama. which I guess just really rushed to the front of the line because they were done with whatever restrictions were required. So, I think that we're going to start to see events, tech events, other events kind of happen at this point. And it's, that's all I know right now. The only one that I really know of is Macaduck, which has said this is happening. It's in Brighton this year, not in London. So that means fly into Gatwick, folks. Because if you fly into Heathrow, you've got a long transit experience ahead of you. So fly into Gatwick and then take the train south. It's cool. But the that whole adventure is still up in the air. It's funny. I've gotten our first round of marketing schedules for 2021 or 2022 from our marketing teams, and there's a lot of conferences on the docket that are saying this is going to happen. I mean, IT Nation happened in Orlando last month, and I politely said thank you, but no thank you, because at the time my son was not yet vaccinated. And so now our family is all vaccinated across the board. We are traveling for the holidays in N95s and hoping lateral tests are going to cover everything that we need to do. I mean, they're saying it really at the end of this process, we're all going to get it. The question is, are we going to get it bad? And so, and that's the hope here. That's really what vaccination and boosters give us, is not getting it bad. And
well, I'd say a happy story and get together is I moved to Vancouver this year, and I've been getting together with Matt X of MDOYVR in the park here for a little outdoor walk and talk. And I tell y'all, he misses everyone, and he is eager to get back in the room with everyone. He loves to get the community together with all his heart and soul. So when the time comes, I'm sure it'll be back on.
For sure.
Yep. Matt's one of the good ones, and he's very community conscious, and we love his event. Mac DevOps is one of the good ones. So Vancouver, lovely.
That's a beautiful part of the world. Oh, jealous.
Yeah, good bars.
Good coffee.
Yeah.
Lots of good things in Vancouver.
Good everything.
Yeah, good
Great.
All of the things.
Great rain.
Yeah.
Really nice rainbows, actually. Seen more rainbows in a year in Vancouver than probably like the rest of my life.
Yeah, I'm seriously considering for the first time ever doing like a whole because I work for a fully remote company now. Like just driving on Saturday, Sundays, and then planting somewhere for 5 days and doing a solid 5 days, and then just go all the way to the West Coast, go up to Vancouver, stay in there for a week or two, and then just kind of go all around. I'd love to do that.
Nice.
Nate, come say hi if you're up this way.
Oh, I will, definitely.
Or if you
I love it up there.
Northeast.
All right. And on that note, I'm going to end this stream and say Happy New Year, Happy Holidays. See everyone in the new year.
Bye, friends.
Bye.
Happy 10th.